You are listening to Mining Stock Education, where you'll learn from the top leaders in the natural resource sector and uncover quality mining investment opportunities.
I had a saying recently I'm kind of trying to adopt from as I was saying that lithium is the new oil in some extent. It's so consistent with regard to its application in energy that it's kind of that analog, not quite the same, but yeah. So I would say my personal favorite would be lithium.
Hi guys, this is Brian Lenny of Mining Stock Education and Junior Stock Review. Today with me, I have a new guest, Frank Nikolic, VP of CRU's North America, Base and Metals Battery Team. Frank, it's great to have you. And since you're a new guest, why don't we start off with an introduction to yourself and your role at CRU?
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. It's a pleasure to be here. So a little bit about myself. So I've been 20 years in the mining industry, all of that with a major, Vale, to be specific. It was Inco and then Vale, in a variety of roles. So my first thing, I'm a mineral processing engineer by background. So I'm a metallurgist. So I did that for about 8 to 10 years. Got my MBA, and then I switched out of that into more the corporate world. The first was competitive intelligence, so understanding what everybody else is doing in our space. And then they put me in managing strategic planning. So I did a lot of M&As, due diligences, cash flow evaluations, project valuations, internal, externals, all the fun stuff. And then I went back to market intelligence. I managed a team there, taking care of all the supply, demand, price forecasting, short-term, long-term, commercial strategies. And then I did that for about 4 or 5 years. And then I moved on to, I said, I need a bit more variety in my life. So I went to commercial operations. First was sales planning, performance planning, and digital transformation. And then they gave me global logistics and the global order to cash at the back office, so the revenue side of things. And then earlier this year, I decided to join CRU. And CRU is a London-based company. They have offices all over the world. But what they do is they provide intelligence, market intelligence, in essence, through analysis, through data aggregation, through insights, and events, and certainly pricings to the commodity space. So we cover a whole slew of commodities. My role here, I'm the VP for the base and battery metals. It's a new role. I'm based in Canada. It's the first hire in Canada. We have another one person joining very recently as well. So we're looking to grow. Because Canada is I think, it always was a huge anchor in mining, but it increasingly can become an even bigger anchor, especially as we have some huge mega trends that we have to manage in this space.
Yeah, I know it certainly is, especially with what's going on in the world today. North America especially looks like a great place to develop and expand. So we're going to be talking about energy transition and supply chains and such. I thought we'd start off by talking, and we'll center our conversation around probably the Western perspective, or let's say North America. So if we break the net zero emissions goal down into 3 parts, and we say it's energy generation, transmission and storage, and transportation. In your view, which of those 3 areas is lacking the most in terms of investment?
I would say it's a little bit of all of them. From the mining perspective, I would say it is the generation of the materials that are needed to support the transition. So like you said, I would expand it to 4 things. I would say how we generate energy, how we transport energy, how we store energy, and how we use energy. So everything about energy, I keep repeating the word, is changing. How we interact with energy. We used to be in this fossil age, and now we are rapidly moving into this green age. And to do that transition, we need a lot of metals, particularly nickel, lithium, copper, cobalt. We still need a lot of specialty steels, aluminums, and so on. So in this case, I would say that the making of the battery and the facilities, that's being developed and it's being built out. And the EV, the putting together the car is also going to build up, because already a lot of OEMs exist and they're just retooling, and it's, believe it or not, it's actually a bit cheaper to produce an EV than a regular car, so they're benefiting with that. But we have to kind of scale it back to a little bit more to say, well, what's lacking for that infrastructure? We need a lot more infrastructure to transmit the new renewable energy, let's say, bases of power generation, and to store energy. Because one of the things that as we move everything to electric is the burden on the infrastructure, right? This is the problem that's repeating itself from the 1940s, when back in the UK, everybody was flipping their tea kettles at the same time after work, and it just collapsed the grid. So because the way the energy is generated, it's never consistent. It's always actually consistent, but the use is not consistent because at night we all sleep. So in this case, you would need big energy storage banks, and then we had a project Tesla most recently executed in Australia. It was a couple of years ago, but I think recently it's come into call it production. And then if you take a step back as well, is how we generate energy. I think that's continued to be built out with solar, with wind, with offshore. And as I said, all of that needs all the metal. And what I think, since we're talking mining, is that is lacking, I would say, investment, especially on the Western supply side of things.
Right. It's interesting with the three, or that's at least how I sort of look at it. And in some ways, I feel like we're kind of putting the cart before the horse. We're starting with sort of the transportation end, and almost in my mind, I almost look at that as the end product, because that energy transition from fossil fuels or nat gas, let's say, to solar and wind. Without that storage, we saw what happened in Germany with it just not working. And so it seems to me like that would be where the biggest push is, but it doesn't seem to be that way. Talking about this, let's start with the energy generation side of things and this push towards solar and wind. And what is that impact? Can you quantify to some degree of what that means to the metals markets, and what metals may be most impacted by this transition?
Perfect. So on the energy generation side, I would say that copper is probably the more impacted metal, just because it's in everything. It's in the motor. It's in to generate them from the wind turbine. You got the electric motor. It's more going towards copper windings versus permanent magnets, because rare earths are rare for a reason, and there's a lot of international competition for it, which I'm sure we'll touch upon later. So I would say from this infrastructure and renewable energy, I would say I would say copper is the one that's most impacted from that perspective. Actually, we just did some work very recently. I gave a talk in a few places where, without this energy transition, looking over the mid longer term, copper demand growth is only like 0.3% year over year. But so it's stagnant in essence. 0.3 is not growing much at all. And there's reasons for that. The reason is really that what was a driver in the copper demand, which was China, it's maturing as an economy. So we'll see a lot of traditional demand starting to peter away as China's need to industrialize and urbanize is coming to an end, and they're entering a mature economy phase. And then with this energy transition and the three things that are driving copper demand in this space is obviously electric vehicles, renewables, and infrastructure build out. So all those three things increase copper demand from 0.3 to 1.1, and that's a threefold increase in the growth rate, which is huge. So this is in essence breathing new life in copper demand, which is huge for copper.
Right. And so in terms of from the perspective of North America or North America and Europe, where do you think where is this development of the copper going to come from? Is a relationship with South America? That seems to be where a lot of the biggest copper discoveries have been. But from a nationalist perspective, the security of supply chain, it seems like people are competing over South American metals. So is it going to have to be developed within Canada and the States, or even in Europe, or is there other places where that supply chain can be kind of mended together and support us? It's absolutely. I think you touch upon a really interesting topic. So, and then let's kind of pause on that and open it up a little bit. So I think one of the important megatrends that is upon us is this emergence of multipolarity and the emergence of BRICS as an economic bloc to compete with us in the West. And China, and this is led by China by and large. And China has been very busy with the Belt and Road Initiative. They've been incredibly successful. I think this is the 10th year. And they have been, and we at CRU, we've done an assessment of, if you look at mining, refining, processing, building of CAM, so cathode active materials for the batteries and so on, and how much is Chinese company ownership in terms of equity basis. And they've, in some of these steps, they're almost 80%
controlled by China or Chinese linked entities. So they've been pretty busy. They knew this trend was coming and they've prepared for it, which left us kind of in the trying to play catch up. And we have the IRA and the Green New Deal that the Europeans are doing that's trying to inject a lot of money into the system to attract supply. And to your point, okay, on the copper side, we had the traditional South American, Chile, now Peru as well as emerging. Brazil is pretty big in copper as well, not as big as Chile, certainly, or Peru. So that's the traditional one. And that will continue to be a big source of copper. And I would say Africa is also, especially DRC, Zimbabwe, Zambia, really big when it comes to copper as well. And we have some projects coming up in Indonesia, which are also large. We have the Grasberg, which is a big one, but also a couple of new projects. That's not enough. And to the point that when we talk about securing of the supply chain, I think a lot of companies will need to re-risk their exposure to geopolitical tensions. And there was a recent report by the OECD, came out in April, and they talked about this competition for resources and the restriction on the trade of commodities. We've seen China issue restrictions on rare earths, germanium, gallium, saying no, this is not going to be exported. And they've noted, the OECD said that there was a 5-fold increase in these trade restrictions since they started taking measurements in 2009. So over the last 15 years, we've had a 5-fold increase. And that, I think, is only going to increase because we've seen a sudden increase in tension all across the globe. It's not quite accidental that these things happen. I think there is just, these powerhouses are emerging and saying, look, they're standing up to each other and there's going to be butting heads. We just have to live through that turmoil, unfortunately. But in that, there's a lot of opportunities. I do think that especially for Canada, given our natural abundance of resources that we have and our, let's say, friendly jurisdiction in the Western world, it will become a natural anchor. So to the supply chain. So when I talked about re-risking the supply chain or de-risking it, all these companies need to ask themselves a very simple question. How much of my supply chain am I willing to, or rather, can I operate if half of my raw material suddenly I have no access to it? I mean, that's an important question. Or what percentage of my supply chain can I leave at risk and still be a going concern, so I can still operate? I don't know what that number is. I'm sure that it's being crunched, as we speak, by some of these companies who are maybe more ahead of than others, and that will naturally kind of start pivoting a lot of, I think, attention towards safe, friendly jurisdictions, which I think, as you said, I think Canada is going to play that important role.
Right. And so do you think that's across the spectrum, not only from the mining, but I think one of the biggest question marks I think that I have as an investor is one of the biggest things about these mines is their proximity to smelters or, the secondary refinement part of the integrated chain. So do you think that because it's funny because environmental laws and environmental regulations probably have never been higher, yet it seems like smelters and this secondary refinement, if we want to keep that chain within house, is going to have to be, that's also going to have to be a higher priority for the country. So do you foresee that too? Do you think governments are going to push permitting timelines up, maybe loosening some of the environmental regulations to get some of these smelting facilities that, I think for most investors there, it's what is your proximity to China? Because that's where the offtake's probably going to go.
It's a good question you ask. So I spent a little bit of time recently talking with juniors and developers and mid-tier companies. And the number one complaint that I've received when asked is the permitting and the licensing. It seems to be a bit more delayed than usual. It's more burdensome. But that is the way of things. If the whole, let's say, this whole story is look, we have a climate we want to manage, we want to take care of that, so that there's things that we have to do to do that. So I don't think that's going to loosen, despite, let's say, the need to do it. I do think more it's going to be, if we are smart about it, is it could be a barrier of entry into our markets from companies and entities that aren't as rigorous or as demanding as us. It needs to be, because otherwise our industry is going to go, not going to be healthy, because we're going to have this cheap, dirty material competing with us, right? So that's been a problem for quite a while. But I think our people that govern us should take advantage of the fact that we have such high level of standards when it comes to the care of the environment, and put a barrier of entry, because I think that's really the only way to allow us to kind of compete. But you're right. The biggest thing was, how close are you to China, because everything is done there. I do think there is going to be some transition back here. It has to, particularly because of the geopolitical tensions. You can't just rely on China, who can suddenly close the door, not because maybe there's geopolitical tension, but because they want to keep the value add on their side and restrict the flow so their companies can compete in the Western space. And because they've actually leapfrogged us already. I don't know if we haven't seen it yet, but we will soon see a lot more Chinese companies and Chinese cars that we're directly competing with here, which isn't bad. I mean, we're open markets, right? But this sort of competition ought to be fair, right? However we define fair, there needs to be some consideration to that. Yeah.
Right. Like, like the nickel market, for instance, with Indonesia, and, they put restrictions on exports of nickel, and it was all to bring in, the secondary refinement into their border instead of shipping the raw product to China and having it processed there. Right. But then it comes up with this, this new nickel matte end product that they're creating, and the nickel matte invariably leads to nickel sulfate. And, when it looks to that supply chain right now, like, I know that regulation is there, but from what I can tell, we're still getting infiltrated from this so-called, dirty nickel. And it might change, the address of who shipped it might change, but invariably its end source is Indonesia. So it'd be interesting to see how that changes, or if it necessarily does, over the next, decade or so, leading up to 2030, and then of course 2050. Going on the energy generation side of things, like for instance in Ontario, we came up, or the Ontario government has put in $1 billion into development of SMRs. And SMRs, I think, is a really interesting way of kind of moving forward with this, zero carbon emissions goal. But the thing is, with the SMRs, it looks like from what I read, we're still 10 years away from having that developed and commercially operating. So where do you think from the transition, like, is nuclear going to be a big part of that transition? Or are we looking at, is this plainly a solar, wind, maybe geothermal type of move in the energy transition?
I can't help but imagine that nuclear is going to play a big role here. I think the attitudes, especially in Europe, are changing when it comes to nuclear. I do think it's always been green. I think there's a stigma to it because of the catastrophic failures that have occurred and can occur that don't exist with other types of energy generation technologies. Plus, in Canada, we have CANDU reactors, so which is actually a really unique way to utilize low enriched uranium to generate power. So which is I think a really neat offering. So I do think that it's going to be part of the energy mix. I don't think we can solely go from solar and wind and geothermal, just because those ones aren't generating power consistently and constantly, whereas something like nuclear would, I would say. So I think I still do expect it to be part of the mix.
So, but considering the timeline for those kind of projects, and if 2050 is indeed the goal, doesn't a decision or the money have to be transferred there like relatively soon? Don't you think? Like, to me, it's like, if it takes 5 to 10 years to develop a regular nuke plant, how, like, when you've got 26 years up until 2050, how do you do this? Is it going to be 20 plants that are going to be built in the next 10 years, or it's an interesting dichotomy in choice.
I agree, and the same problem we have with mining and mining investment. Like, just looking at it, just because you talked about copper, we need about $120 billion over the next 10 years, almost $10 billion a year, to just keep up with the required demand, and that's huge, massive. And with nuclear, like you said, like 10 plants over the next short little while, I don't think we have engineering capacity to deliver on that. So I agree, it's going to be a challenge. I think it's a lofty task in front of us. And yeah, I mean, it's just going to generate a lot of activity and a lot of investment, and whether we make it to the target, I think the point is that we try and get as hit as hard as we can, as fast as we can. And maybe it's not 2050, maybe it's 2075, then we achieve it. But oftentimes these targets are set so that at least we have a goal to work towards. And yes, it's going to be a daunting task, and there's a huge gap in a lot of things. But you kind of start working towards that and deliver as much as you can.
Right. On the battery metal side of thing, and let's talk cathode. Which metal do you think is the biggest opportunity for investors? Like, what should they be looking at?
Really good question. So when it comes to the battery, there's two sides we have to consider: the anode and the cathode. So the anode side is lithium, and that's consistent with regardless of technology. And I'll talk a little bit. There's some competition potentially coming up in the future. I'll talk about a little bit later, but for now, in the foreseeable future, it's going to be lithium. So, and then on the cathode side, there's a mix. We have nickel, cobalt, manganese, iron, phosphate, a couple of other mixes of, and depending how you mix these things, you get a cathode. And the pick of the battery will depend on several things. So, performance, how long it takes to charge, its weight, its volume. A lot of consideration will go into what an OEM, so Ford, a GM, a Tesla will pick as their battery of choice. And just like today, like with regular cars, there's an auto catalyst inside the car, which uses palladium, platinum, rhodium, and the composition of the catalyst will depend on price. So the OEMs will optimize that the composition to minimize the cost. The same thing I think will come with the battery. So you will have some companies will offer a rich nickel battery, which is really high performance in luxury models, whereas entry models will go into the LFP, which is a cheaper battery. And also an LFP battery will need more of the battery bank to give you the same performance as a nickel one. So how you can put it in the car, for example, will matter, right? Because you have some limited space there. So back to your question, which metal is most exciting? To me, it's lithium, to be honest, because it's just so consistent in all the chemistries that you don't have to worry whether it's every 5 years the chemistry is going to change, or every 2 years, however, whatever the cycle of of how the OEMs choose the battery production cycle, and maybe it's 2 years, 3 years, they'll run a production cycle, they'll change it and run it again. But that'll change. So your exposure would be kind of risky in terms of what chemistry am I able to predict is going to be the one that's going to be attractive. On the other hand, lithium is just consistent throughout. I had a saying recently I'm kind of trying to adopt from as I was saying that lithium is the new oil in some extent. It's so consistent with regard to its application in energy that it's kind of that analog, not quite the same, but yeah. So I would say my personal favorite would be lithium.
Okay, so we can talk about lithium specifically, but it probably can be shown in any of the other metals too. Like you're talking about price and how the chemistry changes. And when cobalt spiked, then you had the 532 and the 811 nickel chemistries that came out for the cathodes. But for lithium, while it's not commercially viable yet, direct lithium extraction, to me anyway, seems like a really interesting way to bring brines to the forefront and probably really check that cost curve. So do you think something like DLE is a threat to the lithium price, or is it something that, we're going to see sustained lithium prices around the levels that we're seeing today into the future?
Oh, it's a good question. So the best analog, well, I'm going to refer to oil as the analog. So we had the oil drill well, and that's, for me, that would be like the solars or salars, what they're called, just kind of those ponds that you just let dry out, which are very cheap. And then as the need rose and the cost justified it, you went into shale or oil sands and fracking. Same thing here. So I think there's going to be a price point activation with regards to this different extraction methods. So I do think there's a time and place for those things as well. But with regards to prices, I will have to check. But I would say that we anticipate prices to come down relative to where they are right now, but stay here steady, because there's a lot of lithium. Lithium is not scarce, neither is oil. But it's feeding into which is such a massively growing market that you're bound to need to unlock these different sources of lithium. So I'm sure that it's going to come into the market within the maybe next 20 years for sure.
Right. And does lithium fit into the nationalist or protectionist type of mentality? Like, do you think that each country is going to have to sort of facilitate their own supply of lithium, moving forward to like fit in those battery chains? Or is this something that they're going to be able to like go to South America, go to Africa, go to these other maybe neutral sites to get their lithium?
I think competition is going to play a big role. And so countries have now created their critical and strategic minerals lists, which has meaning in that certain programs get activated to either attract supply or help lower the demand for that. And a lot of metals, lithium included, are added to these lists. So for Canada has its own list. U.S. has its own list. Most recently, U.S. Department of Energy added copper to their list. Who would have thought copper would become strategic? But here we are, because it's just needed to that extent. So as soon as it becomes strategic to a nation for its energy transition and for the survival of their native champions, I think it's going to become critical for them to secure it, either through equity ownerships within, let's say, lithium producing jurisdictions, or to develop their own lithium mining camps.
Okay, so is being on the critical list enough to incite investment? Because it seems to be that's one of the missing links is, we've identified, we need this, we need that. Yet if you look at the equity markets, you look at development in copper, lithium, it really, I don't know if it matters anywhere in the world, but there seems to be a lack of investment. So how do you think, are these critical lists enough to spur investment from governments, from big investors, from the battery companies?
Good question. The trouble with those lists is pretty much everything's on the list today, which makes it really problematic to focus on any one thing. So that's why I think money has a really hard time finding what to focus on versus being spread like butter on bread. So I would think that we need something a little bit extra to help focus that sort of investment. So either needs to be a sub-list to say, okay, we're going to prioritize these commodities because they're urgently needed, or this is the particular gap that we have from a risk perspective. But that needs to come from the government, I suppose. But I do think that's needed. I agree. I think right now capital has a hard time focusing on where to go. So everything's competing based on economics, but I don't know if that's just enough.
One of the interesting things, like I think you'd probably agree that a lot of this lack of investment, the criticality of the different metals, probably is easy to foreshadow higher metal prices in the future. Would you agree?
I would agree. Yes, I think everything in mining is cyclical. As though, if you spend enough time here, you've lived through quite a few cycles. So a couple of years ago, it was good for commodity markets because the energy transition was just, was becoming like a very strong story. And there was a strong recognition that, look, we need these metals now, and hence the price of lithium, of cobalt, of nickel, all of them went up. And that incented a lot of fast development. So all the low-hanging fruit development, like in Indonesia, like in South America with regards to lithium, happened. And a lot of this material came, and now we have surplus in the markets. So it's kind of keeping the prices in check. But that's a cycle. Soon enough, demand's going to catch up, and we'll need more of these metals. So we're going to expect another cycle coming probably the next 5 to 8 years. So I do think prices are going to increase to support the incent development for sure.
So in the world that we live in now, you see, the States last year comes out with the Inflation Adjustment Act, and they push money into renewables and such. But the underlying storyline is, the cost of living is going up. And I can it's not funny, but I've been standing in the grocery line. I do grocery shopping for my family. And honestly, over the last few weeks, I've heard so many people complaining in the lineup ahead of me about the cost of groceries. So, obviously people are feeling the crunch, and, high interest rates only exacerbate that pressure. We talk about metal prices going up. We talk about the transition to EVs and renewable energy. And it seems like the cost of living is only going to go up further. And then I see at the local Ford dealership, the Ford Lightning is 110,000 Canadian, something like that, like a roundabout. It's not a hybrid, but it's probably where, to reach these goals where it needs to be. But I guess my question is, who's going to buy the $110,000 Ford Lightning? And it doesn't have to be a truck. That you can find some reasonable price Teslas. But the contractor, the plumber, the framer, he's probably going to have to buy something like that. So I guess the question is, what is the balance between price and what people can actually afford?
That's a very good question, and I just want to echo your complaint with the prices it's unprecedented, honestly. So that is a challenge. So I think and the price is so high that, let's say, subsidy or incentive for the government is just not going to cut it. And I agree. Not going to cut it. And also, a lot of countries are forcing the transition from a regular car to an EV. So we've seen countries put deadlines 2030, 2035. You can't buy a gasoline-powered car anymore. So we'll be faced with that choice, and most of us won't be able to make that choice simply because the entry. So I think there needs to be an evolution of the offering of some sort. If the battery is the most expensive component, then maybe you lease the battery versus buying the battery, which has some implication with regards to the recycling of the battery as well, which is another topic. So I would say that we need, we as a society and the OEMs that offer and sell cars to the public will need to reconfigure how the car is offered so that it actually gets the buy-in from the public that needs to. Because I agree, $100,000 car, nobody's buying that.
It's interesting, so we were talking via email beforehand, and you pointed out this McKinsey article, and I thought one of the really interesting, at the very end of the article, they talked about the super majors, the oil super majors moving into renewables. But there was one line that I thought was particularly interesting, and to me, it's a huge red flag in terms of where things are headed. But they talked about ExxonMobil buying up land, prospective lithium land in the States. And I think to myself, wow, like these super majors are based off or focused on oil and gas exploration and have for, 100 years in Exxon's case. And now they're getting into something in terms of exploration work in a commodity that they have probably not that they can't buy that expertise, but it's a lot different than the oil and gas market in my view. So I wonder how this ends up turning out, because, I think we'd be better off on a dollar cost average to have these guys, continue to put money into oil, and the guys that are, in lithium, focus on lithium, the experts. But it's really interesting where this is sort of headed us, or we're heading. And it really makes me wonder about the cost of living and where it's going, and these, the societal changes, like you kind of pointed out, to people maybe going down to one car is the way I view it, or, working from home 3 days a week or 4 days a week instead of commuting into the city is probably where things have to head for any of this sort of to make sense in my mind anyways. So, let's talk about the kind of sustainability side from these super majors getting into lithium exploration and such. Do you think that that's going to make a major impact to something like the lithium sector, having these super majors come in with boatloads of money and starting their exploration work?
I think so. So as I mentioned earlier, I do increasingly see lithium as the new oil. So it doesn't surprise me that the oil majors are looking to expand into this space. And it's a good thing, because the more money is thrown at a problem, presumably the solution is going to be more product, which means lower prices, trickling down into the end products. For oil companies, I think they have an existential threat in front of them, or an end to an era. Certainly oil is going to still be needed for certain applications. I don't think we're going to be, shaving our addictions as quickly as some people hope. So they're still going to be there, but to a much lesser extent. So they need something new. So whether it's lithium, whether it's other commodities, like the Saudi conglomeration recently bought into Vale at a certain percentage to get into the nickel base. So they're all looking for interesting plays to position themselves for that benefit. But I do think maybe that's the money that we need as a traditional mining sector. Is we need the oil guys to come in and inject all this capital because they have it to just spur this growth. So I do think it's a positive. Yeah.
Well, like, I guess from the point that I'm trying to make is like on the exploration side, there's so much risk. And to me, it's like if that money's going to be put into anything, it is on infrastructure, it's in charge stations, it's in producing nickel mines, or it's in producing copper mines, or those projects that are on the cusp of needing just the financing to get over that line. But again, like it seems like either go starting from grassroots to kind of get into it.
But if I may just add to this, I think part of that is the overall valuation equation. So going into an existing, you're paying a premium because it's being de-risked. Because you found it, you built it, so you're paying a premium to be at that stage of project or development or an asset, right? So I would say that them going to the grassroots is probably the most gain they would get by finding something, as usually it is, right? When you hit the discovery, you've made it rich, right? So
it doesn't have to specifically be what's going on in the Middle East right now, but you can parlay it to Russia, Ukraine in the last couple of years, sanctions, war. It looks like things could really, we were segmented probably to begin with, but this, to me anyways, looks like it could be that much bigger of a thing. Let's go from the point of view that it is going to make things a little bit worse. How does that exacerbate, exactly what we're talking about, this transition? Does it make it harder? Does it make it easier? How does it affect the metals markets?
I would say it makes it significantly harder. So where there was room for cooperation, there's more animosity. But there's room for compromise, there's more competition. I think with the rise of BRICS, and I think the rise of BRICS and these wars are manifestations of the rise of the BRICS, because they're happening at this time where BRICS is expanding, China is on the rise, they're becoming a merchant empire in their own right. They've done really great work to get where they are. But it just means that they've leapfrogged us in terms of, let's say, they make the most EVs in the world, they export the most EVs in the world, and they need a home for that production. And we are a natural home because we are developed, rich, but getting poor every day economies, right? And their cars are coming in at a price point that's going to be, it's not a $100,000 car, it's going to be a $30,000 car, and we'll be buying it because you're going to compare your own pocket and say, which one should I buy? Well, too bad Ford, or, yes, you built here and we want to support you because you're domestic, but your price point is hurting my pocket to the point where I can't not afford to buy a Chinese import. And they're fine. The quality of their cars are just as good, by the way. But in that change, where value is retained in this value chain also shifts. Because there's no wonder that we as a developed economy, we were making all the cars, we were making all the high engineering precision pieces, and we made all the money. But that has changed. And this competition for the raw materials that you need to fuel your economy is going to make it harder. I think the pockets of these deposits in Africa and in South America and Indonesia, it's increasingly being competitive. So and we're going back to kind of looping back to the kind of the original part of the discussion where we talked about, big majors need to re-risk or reevaluate their risk exposure to geopolitics. And do I have a business if suddenly I can't have access to these raw materials? It's not the same as before. It's absolutely not, because in a regular car, let's say, because we talk about cars, you got the engine, and the engine is a set of alloys, mostly iron. And there's some nickel in it, but things that are not so unique or special. But a battery is something completely different. You need different sort of metals in large, much larger quantities than, let's say, a regular car, or an old version car. So I agree with you. It's going to be a lot more competition, a lot more tension, a lot more trade wars for quite some time until a new balance is achieved. Either somebody goes back to be on top, or there's a parity of some sort, and then we live through some, new life, I would say. But in that chaos, there's going to be a lot of opportunity. I think, especially for juniors, for mid-tiers, we have good projects because they'll need to be funded to create that anchor. We'll need an anchor. Without the anchor, we got nothing. So,
right. Frank, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's a tremendously interesting topic, this transition and all the things it's going to do to the metals markets. Appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we can talk again soon.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Brian. All the best.